A millionaire drags his pregnant wife into the storm and ties her to an iron gate, forcing her to kneel in the freezing rain while his housekeeper watches from the window, shaking and terrified. He thinks her silence will protect him, but he has no idea that the same woman he left out in the cold, and the servant he thought too afraid to speak, will expose every secret he's ever buried. What follows is a story of power, cruelty, and retribution, so fierce it turns suffering into strength. Trust me, you won't see the ending coming until we dive in. Tell us what time you're listening, and where you're tuning in from, and drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. It started on a night when the rain refused to stop, the kind of cold Pacific rain that sinks into the bones and never lets go. The mansion on the cliff stood half-lit, its tall windows catching flashes of lightning like the blink of an eye that didn't want to see what was happening inside. Nathan Hale's voice cut through the thunder, sharp, angry, echoing against marble and glass. "You think you can defy me, Olivia?" he shouted, and the sound bounced back at him like the house itself was tired of his rage. Olivia Hayes stood near the staircase, one hand pressed against the curve of her stomach, her face pale beneath the trembling chandelier light. She whispered something he couldn't hear, maybe a plea, maybe a prayer, but it only made him step closer, his breath heavy with the smell of whiskey and storm. Outside, the rain came harder, drumming on the balcony railings, washing the reflection of the world into moving silver lines. Nathan grabbed her arm and dragged her through the open doorway, his fingers digging into her skin as if pain were the only language he understood. "You'll learn to listen," he said quietly, almost calm, which somehow sounded worse than shouting. Olivia tried to resist, her bare feet slipping on the wet stone, the cold cutting through the thin fabric of her sky-blue dress. "Nathan, please," she said, her voice trembling. "The baby." He ignored her. The gates of the property loomed ahead, black, iron, and rain, slicked, glowing under the lightning. He tied her wrists with the leather belt from his coat, looped it through the bars, and forced her to her knees. The gravel bit into her skin. The rain fell harder, flattening her hair against her face until she could barely breathe. From an upstairs window, Laura Kim watched, her hand covering her mouth, her heart pounding so loudly she thought he might hear it. She had seen him lose his temper before, but never like this. She wanted to run out, to stop him, but fear pinned her feet to the floor. Instead, she reached for her old phone, her hands shaking so much the first recording came out blurry. She tried again, framing the shot between the iron bars, the rain streaking the lens. Every flash of lightning burned the scene into her mind, a moving photograph she would never forget. Olivia could taste the salt of the rain and the copper of blood on her lip. She whispered to herself, "Just breathe. Don't fall." The wind tore through the trees, and thunder rolled across the bay like the sound of something ancient breaking. Somewhere behind her, the front door slammed, and Nathan's footsteps faded back into the house. He had left her there, bound and kneeling, a punishment meant to remind her who held the power. For a moment, she thought of the night they had met, when he had promised to protect her, when his hands had felt warm instead of cruel. The memory stung more than the cold. Minutes turned into hours. The rain never eased. Her body shook uncontrollably, but her mind stayed awake, tracing the rhythm of her heartbeat. One pulse for herself, one for the life inside her. "Hold on," she whispered again, and the sound vanished into the wind. The lights of the mansion blurred through the downpour, glowing faintly like ghosts behind glass. Somewhere deep inside, a quiet resolve began to form, small but unbreakable. She realized that survival wasn't about strength, it was about stubbornness, about refusing to disappear. Near midnight, Laura slipped out of the house, her coat pulled tight, her phone hidden in her pocket. She could hear the rain hissing on the gravel, smell the metal of the gate. Olivia was still there, barely conscious, her head bowed, lips moving without sound. "Mrs. Hale," Laura whispered, touching her shoulder. "I'm here. I called for help." Olivia's eyes fluttered open. "Don't," she said weakly. "He'll fire you." Laura shook her head. "Let him. No one deserves this." She knelt beside her, shielding her with the coat, both of them soaked to the bone. The world seemed suspended between lightning strikes, between one breath and the next. When the sirens finally came, their red light cut through the rain like dawn. Paramedics lifted Olivia gently, wrapping her in blankets. their voices calm and professional, though their eyes betrayed horror at what they saw. Nathan stood at the door, arms crossed, expression blank, pretending it was all a misunderstanding. "She overreacted," he said to one of the officers. "She's been unstable for weeks." The officer didn't reply, but the look he gave him said everything. As they closed the ambulance doors, Olivia's gaze drifted back toward the mansion. The rain on the roof shimmered like glass breaking. She realized that something inside her had broken too, but not in the way he intended. Inside the ambulance, the warmth of the heater felt almost unreal. Olivia stared at the condensation on the window, watching it blur the outside world into motionless gray. Her wrists burned where the leather had rubbed her raw. The paramedic asked her name, her due date, her pain level, and she answered each question slowly, mechanically, like someone remembering how to speak. When he asked if she had family to call, she hesitated. "No," she finally said, "not anymore." Her voice was calm, almost steady, but her fingers tightened around the edge of the blanket. She wasn't crying. The tears had already been washed away by the storm. As the ambulance turned down the coastal road, the ocean appeared beside them, a vast, dark expanse pulsing with waves. Lightning flickered over the water, illuminating the cliffs and the mansion above, distant now, smaller, powerless. Olivia closed her eyes and listened to the sound of the rain fading on the roof. For the first time that night, she allowed herself to breathe deeply. Pain, exhaustion, fear, all of it mixed into a strange clarity. She didn't know how, but she knew this moment would not be the end of her story. The rain had tried to drown her, but instead, it had baptized her into something new. When the city lights finally appeared ahead, she whispered to herself, barely audible over the hum of the engine, "We're still here." "Nah." And in that small whisper, fragile yet certain, the night found its last echo, fading into the steady rhythm of the rain against the glass, a heartbeat that refused to stop. Morning broke slowly over Seattle, the kind of gray morning where the clouds seemed to press down on everything, flattening sound, color, even breath. The ambulance had stopped hours ago, but in Olivia Hayes's mind, its siren still echoed somewhere behind her eyes, fading and returning like a memory she couldn't silence. She opened them to a ceiling light, too white, too steady, the sterile hum of machines filling the space around her. A soft voice said her name, gentle, careful, as if it might break apart if spoken too loudly. "Mrs. Hayes, can you hear me?" She turned her head slightly, the movement small but heavy, and saw a man in a white coat standing beside the bed, his eyes calm yet full of something that looked like concern too deep for words. Dr. Mason Reed had been on shift for 16 hours when they brought her in, drenched and nearly unconscious, her skin ice-cold, her pulse weak. He had seen many forms of pain in his years at the hospital, but this one carried a quiet that unsettled him. "You're safe now," he said, checking the monitor as her eyes flickered open. "You're at Street Helena Hospital." Olivia tried to speak, but the sound came out broken, as if her throat had forgotten how to form words. "The baby," she whispered, and for a moment her body stiffened, bracing for an answer she was afraid to hear. Mason leaned closer, his tone steady. "The heartbeat is weak, but it's there. You need rest, both of you." Relief came in a slow wave, not joyful, just enough to let her exhale. She closed her eyes again, the tears slipping quietly into her hair. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and rain carried in by the draft through a cracked window. Outside, the drizzle hadn't stopped, tracing silver paths down the glass. Olivia lay still, her wrists wrapped in gauze, her skin raw where the leather had rubbed her. When she lifted her hand, the IV line tugged gently, reminding her of the fragility of everything. Mason stood at the foot of the bed, writing notes, but his eyes lingered on her a moment longer than protocol required. He had read the intake report, heard the paramedic's account, and something inside him refused to file this case away as routine. "Did anyone come with you?" he asked quietly. She shook her head, eyes unfocused. "No one," she said. The words hung in the air, hollow but final. Hours passed. Nurses came and went, adjusting blankets, checking vitals, speaking softly as if the walls themselves demanded quiet. Each sound felt distant, filtered through water. Olivia drifted between waking and sleep, between the room and the memory of the gate. Sometimes she heard his voice again, low and cold. sometimes just the rain. She pressed her hand to her stomach and whispered, "I'm still here." It wasn't a prayer this time, just a fact. The nurse, a woman named Ellen, paused by her side. "You're strong," she said softly, placing a folded towel near the bed. "Most people wouldn't have survived that long in the cold." Olivia looked at her and nodded faintly. "It wasn't me," she said. "It was the baby. She kept me awake." Ellen smiled, sadly. "Then she's already saving you." Later that afternoon, Mason returned, holding a small envelope in his hand. His voice was low but certain. "This is your copy of the medical report. Keep it safe. It's proof of what happened." Olivia stared at it for a long time before taking it, her fingers trembling slightly. "He'll find a way to make it disappear," she said, more to herself than to him. Mason's expression hardened, the kind of quiet anger that belongs to people who have seen too much injustice. "Not if you don't let him," he replied. "Truth leaves marks, even when people try to bury it." Their eyes met, not as doctor and patient, but as two people who understood something about survival. As evening crept in, the light outside turned softer, bluer, and the city began to fade behind the curtain of rain. Olivia asked for a mirror. The nurse hesitated but handed her one. She looked at her reflection, almost unrecognizable. Her cheeks were hollow, her lips cracked. A faint bruise shadowed her jaw. Yet beneath the exhaustion there was something else, a kind of stillness she hadn't known before. "I look like a ghost," she murmured. "No," Ellen said quietly from the doorway. "You look like someone who came back." The words lingered long after the nurse left, circling in her mind like light touching the edge of a wound. That night, the hallway lights dimmed, and the hospital grew quiet except for the rhythmic beeping of monitors and the distant shuffle of footsteps. Olivia couldn't sleep. She watched the rain sliding down the window, tiny rivers catching the reflection of streetlights. Somewhere out there, Nathan was giving his statement, telling the world a version of events polished and controlled. She could almost hear his voice on the news, calm, calculated, telling reporters his wife had suffered a breakdown, that she needed privacy, that he loved her deeply. The lies would be believed, at least for a while. He had money, charm, and the patience of a man used to controlling narratives. She had only the truth and a bruised body that no one wanted to see. Mason entered quietly near midnight, checking her vitals again, though they hadn't changed. He glanced at the television in the corner, where Nathan's face filled the screen, perfectly composed beneath the headline, "Billionaire Speaks Out." Mason muted the sound, his jaw tightening. "You don't have to watch that," he said softly. Olivia didn't look away. "I want to," she answered. "I need to remember who he is." After a moment, Mason nodded. "Then remember it clearly. Don't let the story shift." He adjusted her for, then paused, as if debating whether to say more. Finally he said, "You're not alone in this, even if it feels that way." She met his eyes, searching for any reason to believe him. For the first time, she found one. When he left, she sat in silence, the television now showing a weather report. More rain coming, another storm rolling in from the Pacific. She thought of the ocean beyond the city, endless and gray, and how it could hold both destruction and peace in the same breath. Her hand moved to her stomach again, feeling the faint flutter that reminded her why she was still breathing. The doctor's words echoed in her mind, "Truth leaves marks." She traced the gauze on her wrist and realized he was right. Pain left evidence too, carved into the body and the soul, impossible to erase completely. Before dawn, she turned off the TV, closed her eyes, and let the sound of the rain fill the room. It wasn't cruel anymore, just steady, familiar, almost kind. The city outside was still sleeping, the lights blinking faintly in the fog. For the first time since that night, she didn't feel like she was drowning. She didn't feel safe yet, but she felt something close to it, a fragile peace, built on exhaustion and quiet defiance. And as the rain softened against the glass, Olivia whispered into the stillness, "We made it through the night." The words settled gently into the dark, like a small flame refusing to go out, and the world, for a brief and merciful moment, felt still. The rain had finally stopped, but the air still carried the smell of it, that faint scent of wet asphalt and distant salt from the sea. Olivia Hayes sat by the hospital window, her fingers tracing the condensation that formed small rivers across the glass, watching the way the city below moved, as if nothing had happened. The world outside was indifferent. The buses running, people walking under umbrellas, unaware of the woman on the 5th floor who was quietly trying to remember who she used to be. Her body still ached in places she didn't want to touch, and her wrists were wrapped in fresh gauze, the bruises already fading into a dull blue. She hadn't spoken much since the night she was admitted, only nodding when the nurses asked questions, only whispering when the doctor came by to check her pulse. There were too many words trapped behind her lips, and none of them felt safe to say aloud. Laura Kim appeared at the door that morning, holding a paper bag and a thermos of tea. Her hair was damp, her face pale from lack of sleep. She looked older somehow, not in years, but in weight, as if what she had witnessed had taken something from her too. Olivia's eyes widened slightly when she saw her, part relief, part fear. "You shouldn't be here," she said quietly, her voice rough from disuse. Laura shook her head. "I needed to make sure you're alive." She sat down on the edge of the chair, her hands shaking as she poured the tea into a small cup. "They told me you'd been discharged yesterday, but I knew it wasn't true." Olivia looked at the cup without reaching for it. "He knows you filmed it, doesn't he?" she asked. Laura froze, her eyes darting toward the door. "I think he suspects," she whispered. "He called me this morning, said I was ungrateful, said people forget who feeds them." The words hung in the air, heavy and sour. Olivia could almost hear Nathan's voice behind them, calm and cruel. The same tone he had used before tying her to the gate. She swallowed hard, then looked back at Laura. "You still have the video?" Laura nodded slowly, her fingers twisting the fabric of her skirt. "Yes, I copied it onto a drive and hid it, but I don't know what to do next." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The hum of the fluorescent light filled the silence like static. Finally, Olivia said, "Send it to someone who won't be afraid to show it." Her voice was flat, not angry, just certain. Laura hesitated. "Who would that be?" Olivia turned back to the window, her reflection pale against the gray sky. "Someone who still believes truth matters." That same evening, after the nurses made their last rounds, Laura sat in her car outside the hospital, her breath fogging the windshield. She scrolled through her contacts, her thumb hovering over a name she hadn't used in years. Eric Cole, investigative journalist. He used to write stories about corruption, about men like Nathan Hale. He had paid for it with his career, his articles quietly pulled, his reputation smeared by the powerful people he exposed. Laura hesitated only a second longer before pressing call. The line rang twice before a man's voice answered, low and wary. "Who is this?" She gripped the phone tighter. "My name's Laura Kim. I work for Nathan Hale. I have something you need to see." There was silence, then the faint click of a lighter, followed by his measured reply. "You have 10 seconds to convince me this isn't a trap." "I recorded him," she said quickly, her breath catching. "He tied his wife to a gate. In the rain. She's pregnant." Another pause, longer this time. When he finally spoke, his tone had changed. "Meet me tomorrow. The diner on 99, the one by the old bridge. Noon. Don't bring anyone." Then he hung up. Laura stared at the phone screen, her reflection staring back at her, eyes wide with both fear and something that looked like resolve. She started the car, the rain beginning to fall again, soft but steady, as if the sky itself wanted to wash away the weight of what she had just done. The next day, Olivia sat alone in her hospital room, the television muted, the news crawling with stories about Nathan's upcoming charity gala. His face filled the screen, polished, smiling, speaking about family values and the importance of compassion. She felt something cold twist in her chest, not quite anger, not quite grief, but the sharp recognition of a lie repeated so often it almost sounded true. The nurse came in to check her vitals and asked if she wanted the volume turned up. "No," Olivia said softly, her eyes never leaving the screen. "I already know how this story ends." "That." Meanwhile, Laura waited in the corner booth of the diner, her coat still damp from the drizzle. The place smelled of coffee and fried eggs, the kind of comfort that belonged to people who still believed in normal mornings. Eric arrived a few minutes late, wearing a worn leather jacket, a notebook tucked under his arm. His eyes were sharp but tired, the kind of tired that comes from fighting battles no one else sees. He slid into the booth across from her and looked straight at her face before speaking. "You said you worked for Hale." She nodded. "I did, and you're still breathing. That's a miracle in itself." His voice carried no humor, only fact. She placed the flash drive on the table between them. "Everything you need is here," she said. "I can't keep it anymore." He didn't reach for it immediately. "Do you understand what this means?" he asked quietly. "If this is real, it won't just destroy him. It'll destroy everything around him." Laura's gaze didn't waver, then let it. For a long time, they sat in silence, the rain tapping lightly against the window, the coffee cooling between them. Eric finally picked up the drive, slipping it into his pocket like a secret too heavy to hold. "Does she know?" he asked. "The wife?" Laura nodded. "She's the one who told me to do it." He studied her for a moment, then exhaled. "Tell her I'll find a way to make people listen." As he stood to leave, Laura's voice stopped him. "Be careful," she said. "He owns more than just buildings." Eric gave a small, tired smile. "So do I. I own the truth. And that still counts for something." That night, Olivia couldn't sleep. The hospital lights dimmed, and the sound of distant traffic hummed like a restless dream. She thought of Laura driving home, of the risk she had taken, of the unknown journalist now carrying her story like a fragile flame through the dark. She didn't know if the world would believe her, or if Nathan's power would drown it out again, but she knew something had shifted. For the first time since the night of the rain, she wasn't just surviving. She was waiting, not for rescue, but for the truth to rise. When dawn broke, the sky over Seattle was pale and clean, the rain clouds thinning into mist. Olivia turned her face toward the window, feeling the first faint warmth of light touch her skin. The city kept moving, but inside that quiet room, time slowed just enough for her to breathe without fear. She closed her eyes and whispered a single word, more to herself than to anyone else. "Soon." And with that, the morning settled, carrying her voice into the soft rhythm of a world that was finally beginning to listen. By the time the video reached the public, the sky over Seattle had turned the color of metal, heavy and pale, like the city itself was holding its breath. The footage was short, grainy, filmed through a rain-streaked window, but it didn't need to be perfect. The image of a man tying his pregnant wife to an iron gate while the storm beat down around them was enough to make the world stop for a second. It spread across phones and news feeds like lightning finding its next strike, shared in whispers at offices, replayed on evening news channels, debated by people who didn't know her name but felt the weight of her suffering in their bones. Somewhere between the static and the outrage, Nathan Hale's empire began to tremble. Inside his glass office overlooking the bay, Nathan sat behind a desk that looked too clean for the kind of chaos it now contained. Screens lined the wall behind him, each one playing a different news segment, each voice speaking his name with a tone that mixed curiosity and disgust. "It's fake," he said sharply, cutting off his public relations manager before she could even finish her sentence. "Deepfake technology is everywhere. We'll discredit it." His reflection in the window looked thinner than usual, his tie slightly loose, his fingers tapping against the glass in uneven rhythm. "You don't understand," the manager replied softly. "People believe what they feel, not what they're told, and they feel something real in that video." For a moment, Nathan didn't answer. The silence between them felt like standing on ice, waiting to hear the first crack. Across town, in a modest apartment above a bookstore, Eric Cole watched the same news footage, his coffee untouched on the table. He didn't feel pride, not yet. Just the uneasy quiet that comes when the truth finally leaves your hands and enters the world no longer yours to protect. He had done his part, verified the video, traced the timeline, confirmed every detail, but the weight of it stayed on his shoulders. He knew what men like Nathan Hale did when cornered. They didn't crumble. They fought back. He looked down at his notes, the ones he had promised to keep safe, and muttered to himself, "Now it begins." No. Meanwhile, Olivia Hayes was hundreds of miles away from the noise, tucked inside a weathered seaside cabin that smelled of salt and pine. The waves outside struck the rocks in steady rhythm, echoing through the wooden walls like a heartbeat that refused to stop. Father Thomas Byrne, the retired priest who had offered her shelter, sat at the small kitchen table, stirring sugar into his tea. "It's out there now," he said quietly, his eyes never leaving the steam rising from the cup. "People are seeing what he did." Olivia didn't answer at first. She stood by the window, one hand resting on her stomach, watching the horizon dissolve into mist. "Seeing isn't the same as believing," she said. Her voice was soft but steady, shaped by exhaustion and something heavier, the knowledge that truth alone was rarely enough. Father Thomas nodded, understanding in the way only someone who had seen too much could. "Maybe," he said, "but it's a start, and starts matter." She turned to look at him, the corners of her mouth lifting slightly, though not into a smile. "I don't want to be a story," she said. "I just want my life back." He leaned back in his chair, his expression kind but firm. "You can't take back what's gone, Olivia. You can only decide what to do with what's left." His words lingered in the air like smoke, finding their way into the quiet space between her fear and her resolve. Outside, the wind began to rise, bending the trees until they groaned under the pressure. Olivia stepped onto the porch, her bare feet brushing against the cool wood. The rain hadn't started yet, but the clouds were gathering again, thick and dark over the water. She thought about the man she had once loved, the one who used to bring her coffee in bed, the one who had knelt beside her when they first heard the baby's heartbeat. That man was gone, replaced by something colder, something hungry for control. And yet, in some cruel way, he still lived in the corners of her mind, his voice creeping in when the wind grew quiet. "You'll never be free of me," it whispered. She closed her eyes and whispered back, "Watch me." Back in the city, Nathan's mistress, Vanessa Cross, sat at a vanity surrounded by soft gold lights, scrolling through her phone as headlines filled her feed. Her perfectly manicured fingers trembled slightly as she read the comments, words like monster, abuser, liar. She had built her fame on beauty and association, but this was not the kind of attention she knew how to survive. "They're turning on you too," Nathan said when he called her, his voice tight. "You need to release a statement. Say it's fake. Say Olivia's unstable." Vanessa hesitated, her reflection staring back at her like a stranger. "Nathan, people saw her. They saw the rain. They heard her cry." "Then remind them who I am," he snapped. "Remind them what I've built." The line went dead before she could reply. She set the phone down and stared at her own eyes, realizing for the first time that the empire she'd stood beside was cracking, and when it fell, it would not fall quietly. That night, the rain returned. It swept through the streets like memory, pooling in the cracks of sidewalks, running down the sides of skyscrapers that had once carried Nathan's name. On television screens, reporters analyzed the footage frame by frame, politicians gave vague statements about domestic responsibility, and talk show hosts argued about whether justice was a matter of law or conscience. But in one quiet room near the waterfront, a single light stayed on long after midnight. Olivia sat at a desk, the glow of an old lamp washing over papers spread before her, contracts, financial statements, hidden accounts. Each page was another thread she would pull, another mask she would strip away. When Father Thomas walked in, he found her still working, eyes red from lack of sleep. "You need rest," he said gently. She didn't look up. "Rest comes later." He hesitated, then placed a folded blanket on the back of her chair. "You remind me of someone I knew once," he said. "She lost everything too, but she built something better from the ashes." Olivia paused, the pen still in her hand. "And what happened to her?" He smiled faintly. She stopped running. Outside, the first light of morning began to push through the storm clouds, turning the sea from black to silver. Olivia closed the file, her fingers brushing over the stack of evidence as if sealing a promise to herself. She stood, walked to the window, and watched the light spread slowly across the water. It was quiet, but not empty. Somewhere, she could almost hear the faint rhythm of her child's heartbeat, steady and unbroken. For the first time, the silence didn't feel like fear. It felt like the beginning of something she had almost forgotten existed, control. And as the waves rolled toward the shore, soft and endless, she realized that the storm outside was nothing compared to the one she was ready to unleash. The days in the cabin began to blend into one another, marked only by the rhythm of rain against the roof and the sound of waves folding and unfolding beyond the cliffs. Olivia Hayes spent her mornings at the small wooden table, a cup of black coffee beside her, the steam curling upward like the faint memory of warmth she still couldn't quite reach. Her hands, once delicate and careful, now moved with quiet precision, turning over documents that had been sent to her by Eric Cole, financial statements, donation ledgers, and contracts that looked clean until you saw what they were hiding. Every number, every signature, every false transaction was a thread in the net that Nathan Hale had built, and one by one she began to pull. Father Thomas would sometimes step into the room, his footsteps soft on the creaking floorboards, his presence calm but watchful. He rarely asked questions. He simply placed a plate of bread or soup beside her and said, "Eat, Olivia." She would thank him, but the food would often go cold while she worked, her eyes tracing lines of ink like paths through a labyrinth. There was no hatred in her face, only focus. The quiet, determined focus of someone who has lost everything and now has nothing left to lose. Sometimes, when the light through the window dimmed and her back began to ache, she would lean back and close her eyes, listening to the sea. It sounded like breathing, slow and steady, a reminder that life went on even when she didn't want it to. One afternoon, Eric arrived at the cabin, his car tires crunching on the gravel path. The air smelled of wet pine and salt. He stepped inside, shaking the rain from his coat, his expression drawn but hopeful. "You've been busy," he said, glancing at the piles of papers on the table. Olivia didn't look up. "Busy is the only thing that keeps me from remembering." Eric nodded, pulling out a folder of his own. "You were right. His company isn't just laundering money. He's been using a network of shell charities to funnel cash into offshore accounts. And these," he said, tapping the folder, "these are in your name." Olivia's head lifted slowly, her eyes narrowing. "In my name?" He nodded. "Donations? Transfers? Signatures? It looks like you approved every one." She stared at the paper he slid across the table, her own forged signature printed cleanly beneath the date. For a moment, she didn't speak. The only sound was the wind rattling the cabin window. "He made me an accomplice," she said quietly, almost to herself. "He wanted me to go down with him if he ever fell." Eric leaned forward. "Then we make him fall faster." She looked up, meeting his eyes for the first time since he'd arrived. There was no fear left in her, only clarity. "What do you need from me?" she asked. "Your story," he replied. "In your words, not mine." She hesitated, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for a pen. "Then let's begin." "Oh." They worked for hours, the storm outside growing louder, thunder rolling across the sea like a heartbeat out of sync. Eric asked questions with the patience of someone who understood that truth was not a single moment but a long, winding path. Olivia answered them slowly, sometimes pausing to steady her breath. She spoke of the night she was tied to the gate, the silence of the house, the way the rain had felt against her skin, not cold, but cleansing, as if the sky itself had been trying to wash her free. She spoke of the lies, the manipulation, the moments when love had turned to control so quietly she hadn't noticed until it was too late. And as she spoke, she began to feel lighter, as though each word she released took a small piece of pain with it. When the last of her notes were written and the clock struck midnight, Father Thomas entered again, holding a lantern. "You two will catch pneumonia if you don't rest," he said, his voice stern but kind. Eric smiled faintly. "We're almost done." Olivia rubbed her eyes, exhausted but alert. "Father," she said, "do you believe people can change?" He looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Yes, but not all of them want to." She nodded, her gaze drifting toward the window where lightning flashed faintly over the horizon. "Then I'll make sure he does." After Eric left, the cabin felt larger, quieter. Olivia gathered the papers into neat stacks and placed them in a metal box she kept under the bed. She changed into a wool sweater and stood by the fireplace, watching the flames catch. Her reflection shimmered in the glass of the window beside her, pale, tired, but no longer fragile. The storm had begun to ease, the rain thinning to a fine mist that hung in the air like smoke. She stepped outside onto the porch, the wood damp beneath her feet, and looked toward the dark stretch of water. The night smelled of earth and salt, of endings and beginnings intertwined. She thought of her child, the tiny heartbeat that had survived everything, and felt a surge of something close to peace. "You'll never kneel again," she whispered, one hand resting on her belly. Her voice was steady now, not a promise made in fear but in certainty. Behind her, the lamp inside the cabin cast a soft glow through the open door, painting her silhouette against the mist like a quiet witness to her own resurrection. As she turned to go back inside, she noticed the phone on the table blinking. A new message from Eric. It was short, only a few words. "It's working. People are asking questions." She smiled faintly, her eyes reflecting the flicker of firelight. For the first time in months, the thought of tomorrow didn't frighten her. She walked to the window, looking out at the horizon where the ocean met the night, and let out a long, slow breath. The sea was calm now, the waves moving in gentle rhythm, each one erasing what came before it. Olivia watched until her reflection blurred into the glass, until all that remained was the quiet sound of rain returning, not violent this time, but soft, forgiving, like a memory finally learning to rest. And in that silence, she realized that the strength she had been searching for had never left her. It had been waiting, quietly, beneath the noise, patient as the tide, ready to rise again when the world grew still enough to hear it. The television studio was colder than Olivia expected, its walls humming with the quiet electricity of cameras and lights that had seen 1,000 stories but never one like hers. The stage smelled faintly of coffee and makeup, and the low murmur of producers filled the space like a distant tide. She stood just beyond the edge of the set, her hands resting on her stomach, the silk of her light blue dress smoothing under her fingers. It was the same dress she had worn the night of the storm, the one that had clung to her skin like a second layer of shame. Now it felt different, heavier somehow, not because of the fabric but because of what it carried, a past she was finally ready to expose. Eric stood a few feet away, his face calm but his eyes alert. "You don't have to do this live," he said quietly. "We can pre-record, edit it later if you change your mind." Olivia looked at him and shook her head. "If I hide now, I'll never stop hiding." The host, a woman with silver hair and steady eyes, approached with a clipboard and a small smile that was half reassurance, half warning. "5 minutes," she said softly. Olivia nodded, her throat dry but her heartbeat steady. She sat down on the chair at the center of the stage, the overhead lights warming her face, her reflection faintly visible in the camera lens ahead. The studio audience was small, maybe 20 people, but the silence they held felt vast. Somewhere behind the cameras, she knew millions more would be watching from their homes, their offices, their phones, each of them waiting for her to speak. For a brief moment, fear touched her like a hand on her shoulder, cold and familiar, whispering that she was still too small to fight a man like Nathan Hale. But then she thought of the rain, the iron gate, the voice that had once told her she'd never be free, and she felt something stronger than fear. When the red light on the camera blinked on, the host began gently, "Olivia Hayes, thank you for being here. You've chosen to share something deeply personal with the world tonight. Why now?" Olivia inhaled slowly, the sound of her breath catching in the microphone. "Because silence protects no one," she said. Her voice was low but firm, the kind of voice that carried even when it didn't rise. "Because the truth is already out there, and I need people to know it's real." The host leaned forward. "Can you tell us what happened that night?" Olivia's eyes dropped for a moment, her fingers brushing the hem of her dress as if searching for balance. "He said I embarrassed him," she began, her tone measured. "He said I made him look weak in front of his friends. And then he took me outside. It was raining. I thought he was just angry, that he needed to cool off. But he tied my wrists to the gate." A quiet gasp rippled through the audience, but Olivia didn't flinch. She continued, her words steady, almost too calm. "He left me there for hours. I could feel the cold through my bones. I remember thinking I might not make it, but I couldn't scream anymore. The rain had taken my voice." The host's hand trembled slightly as she adjusted her notes. "And your baby?" Olivia smiled faintly, a tired, fragile smile that carried the weight of every sleepless night. "She survived, somehow." The silence that followed was almost unbearable. Even the studio lights seemed to dim, their hum softening, as if the room itself was listening. Then, from the corner of the set, a loud commotion broke the stillness. A door slammed, Voices rose, and before anyone could react, Nathan Hale strode into the studio, his face flushed, his presence cutting through the air like a blade. Security rushed forward, but he waved them off with a commanding gesture. "You're lying," he shouted, his voice echoing through the microphones. "You've lost your mind, Olivia. You're sick." The audience froze, the tension so thick it felt like a storm about to break. Olivia didn't move. Her eyes followed him with the quiet certainty of someone who had already seen the worst of him. "I was sick," she said softly, "but not anymore." Nathan laughed, a brittle sound that didn't reach his eyes. "You think people will believe you? Look at you. You're fragile. You're broken." Olivia stood, her hands resting gently on the table in front of her, her posture straight and deliberate. "I was," she said, "but you taught me how to stand." For the first time, Nathan seemed unsure, his confidence faltering under the weight of her calm. He took a step closer, his voice lowering. "You're ruining yourself," he hissed. Olivia tilted her head slightly. "No," she replied, "I'm setting myself free." The guards finally intervened, their hands on Nathan's arms as he struggled and cursed under his breath. The cameras stayed rolling, the red light didn't turn off, and as they escorted him out, his voice fading into the distance, the studio audience rose to their feet, not in applause, but in stunned, silent acknowledgement of what they had just witnessed. The host reached across the table, placing a hand over Olivia's trembling fingers. "Are you all right?" she asked quietly. Olivia nodded, though her eyes glistened under the lights. "For the first time," she said, her voice breaking just slightly, "I think I am." "Yuan?" After the broadcast, the studio emptied slowly. Technicians spoke in hushed voices, reporters called their editors, and somewhere outside, rain began again, tapping softly on the glass doors. Eric appeared from behind the control booth, his face pale but lit with a kind of awe. "It's everywhere already," he said. "Every network, every feed. You didn't just tell your story, you showed them who he is." Olivia exhaled, her shoulders finally loosening. "Then it's done," she whispered. "No," Eric said gently, "it's just begun." She smiled faintly but said nothing. The air in the studio felt lighter now, almost warm. The stage lights dimmed, leaving only a soft glow on her face. She reached up to remove the microphone, clipped to her collar, her movements slow, deliberate, as if she was peeling away the last layer of silence that had bound her for years. The sound technician offered her a tissue. She thanked him, her voice calm, almost tender. Then she walked toward the exit, each step echoing in the quiet space that had once belonged to her fear. Outside, the city lights blurred through the drizzle, and the reflection of her blue dress shimmered faintly in the wet pavement. For a moment, she stood there, letting the rain touch her face, closing her eyes as the cool drops fell against her skin. It didn't feel like punishment anymore. It felt like cleansing, like coming full circle. Somewhere inside the building behind her, the playback monitors were still running, replaying the moment when she faced him and didn't look away. She opened her eyes and looked toward the horizon where the clouds met the water, her breath visible in the night air. The rain continued softly, steady and endless, but this time she didn't mind. For the first time, it didn't feel like the sky was crying for her. It felt like it was standing with her, and that was enough. The courthouse was older than it looked from the outside, its marble steps worn smooth by decades of feet carrying both guilt and hope. Morning light streamed through the high windows, catching the dust in the air and turning it gold, as if the world outside had paused to watch what was about to unfold. Olivia Hayes stood near the entrance, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her breath shallow but steady. She wore a simple gray coat that fell over her growing belly, the soft fabric fluttering slightly each time the heavy doors opened and let in the wind. Behind her, Eric Cole walked quietly, carrying a folder of evidence and notes, his face unreadable. "You ready?" he asked in a low voice. Olivia turned her head just enough to meet his eyes. "I've been ready since the night he left me in the rain," she said. Her tone was calm, but something beneath it felt unshakable, like a tide that had already decided where it would break. Inside the courtroom, the air was cool and too still, the kind of silence that waits to be filled with stories people wish they didn't have to tell. Nathan Hale sat at the defendant's table, surrounded by a team of lawyers in dark suits who whispered in low, controlled tones. He looked composed, his tie perfectly straight, his posture rehearsed for sympathy. But when his gaze met Olivia's across the room, something flickered in his expression, an instinctive fear quickly buried beneath arrogance. She held his stare for a moment, then looked away, her focus moving to Judge Margaret Owens, who sat high above the courtroom, her silver hair pulled back neatly, her face calm but not soft. The clerk called the session to order, and the first sound of the gavel echoed through the room like thunder breaking a long silence. The prosecutor began, his words steady, each one carrying weight. "Your Honor, this case is not only about wealth or power. It's about control, abuse, and the silence that money tried to buy." Nathan's lawyers objected before the sentence ended, but the judge overruled with a slight motion of her hand. "Proceed," she said simply. Olivia watched from her seat, her fingers tracing the edge of the hospital report Mason Reed had given her. The paper had grown soft from being held too many times. Every number on it, her body temperature, her blood pressure, her heart rate, was a record of survival. It wasn't just evidence, it was proof that she had lived through what should have broken her. When it was her turn to speak, the courtroom seemed to shrink around her. The floor creaked beneath her shoes as she stood, her heart pounding so loud it felt like it belonged to someone else. She took the oath with a trembling hand and sat in the witness chair, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the judge, where sunlight spilled through the window onto the polished floor. "Tell us what happened that night," the prosecutor said. Olivia nodded slowly, her voice barely more than a whisper at first. "It was raining," she began, the words tasting of salt and memory. "He said I embarrassed him. He tied my hands to the gate. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe." She paused, swallowing hard, her fingers clutching the edge of the wooden armrest. "I thought he would untie me when he calmed down, but he didn't." One of Nathan's lawyers stood abruptly. "Objection! Speculation!" Judge Owens raised a hand. "Overruled. Let her finish." Olivia exhaled and continued, her voice growing steadier with each word. "He left me there all night, and when the sun came up, I thought maybe that was it, that the world would end quietly, with rain and silence. The courtroom was so still that even the faint buzz of the lights seemed too loud. She didn't cry, she didn't need to. The truth itself carried enough weight to silence everything else. Then came Laura Kim, the housekeeper, her small frame almost swallowed by the witness stand. Her hands trembled as she adjusted the microphone. "I saw him," she said, her voice cracking. "I saw him drag her outside. I tried to stop him, but he told me to stay out of it." She reached into her bag, pulling out the phone that held the video. The screen flickered to life, the sound of rain and Olivia's muffled voice filling the room. No one spoke. The recording was short, but it was enough. When it ended, the silence that followed was heavier than before, thick with disbelief and quiet rage. Dr. Mason Reed testified next, his tone professional but edged with anger. Her injuries were consistent with prolonged exposure, hypothermia, dehydration, stress-induced trauma. This wasn't an accident. Nathan's lawyers tried to discredit him, questioning his relationship with the victim, but his calm replies left no room for doubt. "My relationship with her," he said, "is the same as any doctor's duty to their patient, to tell the truth." When the defense finally called Nathan to the stand, the mask he had so carefully built began to slip. He spoke smoothly at first, claiming love, misunderstanding, even compassion. "She's fragile," he said to the jury. "She's always been emotional." But his confidence faltered when the prosecutor placed the still image from the video in front of him. "Is that you, Mr. Hale?" Nathan hesitated, his jaw tightening. "It's been edited." "Then explain the rain," the prosecutor said softly. "Explain her voice." For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Nathan said nothing. Judge Owens leaned forward, her hands clasped together. "Mr. Hale, do you understand the gravity of what has been shown here today?" Nathan met her gaze, his eyes cold but uncertain. "I understand I've been betrayed." The judge's voice cut through the air, sharp and final. "No, Mr. Hale, you've been exposed." When the final gavel struck, it didn't sound like an end. It sounded like release. Olivia sat still, her eyes closed for a moment, letting the sound settle inside her. The verdict wouldn't be announced until the next morning, but she already knew the outcome in her heart. She looked at Laura, who smiled through her tears, and then at Dr. Reed, who gave her a small nod. Outside the courthouse, the sky had cleared for the first time in weeks, and the afternoon light stretched across the city in soft, golden streaks. Olivia walked down the steps slowly, each one feeling lighter than the last. The air smelled of wet stone and freedom. She stopped at the bottom and looked up at the courthouse columns rising behind her, solid and still, as if they too had been waiting for the truth to be spoken. "It's over," Laura said quietly beside her. Olivia shook her head just slightly. "No," she replied, her voice calm and sure. "It's finally beginning." She turned toward the street, where the breeze carried the faint scent of rain fading into sunlight, and for a brief, perfect moment, she allowed herself to breathe without fear. The city was alive again, and so was she. The verdict came on a Thursday morning, when the air over the city felt clean after a night of heavy rain. Reporters had already gathered outside the courthouse before dawn, their breath fogging the cool air, their cameras waiting like open eyes. Inside, the tension was quiet but sharp, stretching across the room in invisible lines. Olivia Hayes sat in the front row, her hands folded neatly on her lap, her heart steady in a way that surprised even her. She wasn't thinking about victory or revenge or the faces of those who had doubted her. She was thinking about breath, about how strange it felt to finally take one without fear. Judge Margaret Owens entered the courtroom, her black robe moving softly as she took her seat. The sound of the gavel called everyone to silence, and for a moment it felt like the entire room was suspended in time. Nathan Hale sat across the aisle, flanked by his attorneys, his face pale, eyes bloodshot but still defiant. The polished arrogance that had once defined him was gone, replaced by something smaller, tighter, like a man trapped inside a shell of his own making. The judge's voice, calm and unwavering, filled the space. "This court has reviewed the evidence, the testimonies, and the documentation provided by the prosecution and the defense." She paused, her gaze sweeping the room before resting on Nathan. "Mr. Hale, the court finds you guilty of aggravated assault, coercion, fraud, and obstruction of justice." The words fell like stones into water, sending ripples through every corner of the courtroom. Nathan didn't move. His lawyers leaned in, whispering urgently, but he didn't seem to hear them. The judge continued, her voice even. "You are hereby sentenced to 20 years in federal custody. You will also face civil penalties and forfeiture of assets obtained through fraudulent means." Somewhere behind Olivia, someone gasped softly. Laura Kim reached over and touched her arm, her hand trembling. "It's over," she whispered. Olivia didn't answer. She simply nodded once, her eyes fixed on the man who had once called himself her husband. Nathan finally turned to look at her, his expression unreadable, though something flickered behind his eyes. Anger, maybe, or disbelief, or the hollow recognition that the world he built had collapsed entirely. Olivia met his gaze without flinching. There was no triumph there, no cruelty, only a quiet acceptance. For years, she had lived inside his story. Now he was a footnote in hers. When the guards led him away, his cuffed hands hidden beneath the sleeves of his expensive suit, she didn't watch him go. Instead, she closed her eyes and breathed in, slowly, as if reclaiming the air he had stolen. Outside, the courthouse steps were a mosaic of movement. Reporters calling her name, cameras flashing, strangers holding signs that read "Justice for Olivia." The crowd parted as she descended, the light drizzle catching in her hair. Eric Cole met her at the bottom, holding an umbrella he didn't bother to open. "You did it," he said softly. She shook her head. "We did it." He smiled, though the exhaustion in his face made the gesture look almost fragile. "You know this story isn't just yours anymore," he said. "It belongs to every woman who's been told to stay silent." Olivia looked out at the gathering storm clouds rolling over the city. "Then let them speak," she said. By evening, the news had spread everywhere. Nathan Hale's arrest played on every channel. His empire dissected on talk shows, his face plastered across headlines that once praised him as a visionary. Vanessa Cross, the mistress who had stood beside him through the lies, released a statement full of denial and tears, but the public no longer listened. The illusion had broken. Investors withdrew, properties were seized, and the name Hale Developments became a cautionary tale whispered in corporate corridors. Justice, it seemed, had a sound, The quiet collapse of a man who thought he was untouchable. Olivia watched it unfold from the small living room of her cabin, the firelight flickering across her face. Father Thomas sat across from her, his Bible closed on the table. "You look lighter," he said. She smiled faintly. "Maybe because I finally stopped carrying him." The priest nodded. "Forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting," he said. "It's choosing not to let what happened define what comes next." Olivia looked into the flames, the warmth reflecting in her eyes. "I don't think I'm ready to forgive," she said. "Not yet." He gave a small, understanding smile. "That's all right. Healing isn't measured in forgiveness, it's measured in peace." Later, when the fire had burned low and the cabin settled into quiet, she stepped outside onto the porch. The rain had stopped, leaving the earth damp and fragrant. The night sky stretched wide above her, streaked with pale clouds and faint stars. She stood barefoot, her toes pressing into the cool wood, the air sharp with the scent of salt from the sea. Somewhere far below, waves struck the rocks with a rhythm that felt ancient and familiar. She thought of all the nights she had spent afraid, of him, of the world, of what might happen next. And now, standing alone in the darkness, she realized she wasn't afraid anymore. Her phone buzzed once in her pocket. It was a message from Eric. "He's on his way to prison. No appeals this time." She stared at the screen for a moment, then switched the phone off and placed it on the railing beside her. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of wind and waves, and her own heartbeat echoing softly in her chest. She whispered to the night, "It's done." And the wind seemed to carry the words out to sea, dissolving them into something bigger than sound. Inside, the fire had nearly gone out, leaving only embers glowing faintly in the hearth. Olivia lay down on the couch, pulling a blanket over herself. The baby moved gently beneath her hand, a quiet flutter that made her smile. "We're safe now," she murmured. Outside, the rain began again, but it was a different kind of rain, soft, rhythmic, like a lullaby against the roof. She listened until her eyes grew heavy, the sound blending with the slow beat of her heart. When she finally drifted to sleep, the storm had passed, and the first light of dawn waited quietly behind the clouds. The world had changed, not in a flash or a roar, but in the steady, patient way that truth always does. And for the first time in a long while, Olivia Hayes slept without dreams, wrapped in the kind of silence that doesn't hurt anymore. The hospital smelled of rain and disinfectant, that strange mixture of life and aftermath that only exists in places where people are born and saved at the same time. Outside, the city was still gray from the storm, but inside, the light was gentle, filtered through wide windows that faced the bay. Olivia Hayes lay in the recovery room, her body weak but her heart steady, her skin still glistening with sweat. The nurses moved quietly, their shoes whispering against the tile, their voices calm and low. On the small metal crib beside her, a newborn stirred beneath a pale blue blanket, letting out a soft, uncertain cry that seemed to echo through the quiet like a promise. Olivia turned her head, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, and for a moment she didn't believe the sound was real. Then the nurse leaned over and smiled. "She's strong," she said softly. "You both made it." The baby's name was Hope. Olivia had chosen it months before, during one of those nights in the cabin when the rain refused to stop, and she had wondered if she'd live to see another morning. Now, hearing it aloud, it felt like the first thing in her life that truly belonged to her. She reached out her trembling hand, and the nurse gently placed the baby in her arms. Hope's skin was warm and impossibly soft, her tiny fingers curling around one of Olivia's like they had always known each other. "Hi there," Olivia whispered, her voice breaking with quiet disbelief. "You really waited for me, didn't you?" The baby's eyes fluttered open briefly, the faintest shade of blue reflecting the morning light. It was enough to make Olivia's chest ache with something deeper than relief, something like grace. Dr. Mason Reed entered the room soon after, his scrubs wrinkled, his expression tired but light. "You scared us," he said with a small smile. "For a moment there, I thought you were going to make me earn my paycheck." Olivia managed a weak laugh. "You already did." He checked the monitors, adjusted a tube, then looked at her again, his tone softening. "She's perfect. You should rest." Olivia shook her head slightly, eyes fixed on her daughter. "I've rested enough," she said. "Now I want to see her breathe." Mason hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Fair enough." He started toward the door, then paused. "You know," he said, "most people don't get this far after what you went through. You didn't just survive, Olivia. You came back." She didn't answer, but the faint smile that crossed her face said everything. By afternoon, the news had already reached the outside world. Reporters waited at the hospital entrance, their cameras pointed toward the sliding doors, hoping for a glimpse of the woman whose story had become a symbol of resilience. But Olivia didn't appear. She stayed in her room, the blinds half drawn, the world outside moving without her. Laura Kim visited quietly, slipping in through a side entrance, carrying a bouquet of lilies. The scent filled the room instantly, sweet and clean. "They reminded me of you," Laura said. Olivia looked at the flowers and smiled faintly. "Because they survived the rain?" Laura laughed softly. "Because they grew through it." The two women sat in silence for a while, the baby sleeping between them, the monitor beeping softly in rhythm with her tiny breaths. "He's really gone?" Olivia asked finally. Laura nodded. "He won't hurt anyone again." Evening came slowly, with a soft amber glow spreading across the walls. The nurse dimmed the lights and brought Olivia a small dinner she barely touched. Her thoughts drifted like the tide outside the window. She thought about the girl she had been a year ago, the one who believed love could excuse cruelty, the one who mistook control for care. That girl had died long before Nathan Hale was sentenced. And in her place was someone who had learned that survival wasn't a single moment but 1,000 small choices made every day. She looked down at Hope again and realized this was one of those choices: to stay, to heal, to keep breathing. As night settled, Father Thomas entered quietly, his hands clasped behind his back, his presence warm and steady. "I thought you might want a blessing," he said. Olivia nodded, tears already gathering in her eyes. He stepped closer, placing a hand on her shoulder, his voice low and even. "May this child bring light to the places where darkness once lived. May she grow without fear. May she remind you every day that storms end, but the world goes on." Olivia listened, her tears falling soundlessly onto the baby's blanket. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." The priest smiled. "You don't owe me thanks. You did the hardest part." Later, after everyone had gone, the room grew still except for the hum of the machines and the faint rustle of rain returning outside. Olivia sat in the dim light, watching the reflections of raindrops slide down the window pane. She thought of all the nights she had prayed for something to hold on to, for something that might make the pain make sense. And now, in her arms, she held it, not an answer, but a beginning. Hope stirred slightly, making a small sound that was halfway between a sigh and a dream. Olivia smiled, brushing her thumb over the baby's cheek. "You don't know it yet," she said softly, "but you saved me." Lo, the rain outside thickened, filling the silence with a steady rhythm that felt almost like music. Olivia turned off the bedside lamp and leaned back against the pillow, cradling her daughter close. In the faint glow from the hallway, their shadows merged into one, the outline of a mother and child resting in the calm after a storm. For a long time, she simply listened, to the rain, to the heartbeat against her chest, to the quiet proof that she had survived. When the nurse peeked in later, she found them both asleep, the baby's hand still clutching a lock of her mother's hair. She smiled, turned off the last of the monitors, and closed the door softly behind her. The sound of the latch was gentle, final, like the closing of a story that had finally found its peace. Outside, the rain began to lighten, and somewhere beyond the horizon, the first faint hint of dawn began to rise. In that room, nothing else existed, not the past, not the headlines, not the echoes of pain that had once filled the air. There was only the quiet, the warmth of 2 steady heartbeats, and the endless, patient whisper of the rain. And for the first time in her life, Olivia Hayes felt that the world was exactly as it should be. A full year had passed since the verdict, and Seattle had learned to breathe again. The storms that once lingered over the city seemed lighter now, as if even the sky had decided it had mourned long enough. In the center of downtown, where the glass towers caught the early sun, a new building stood quietly between the streets, white stone, wide windows, and a name carved in silver across the entrance. The Hope Foundation, The letters caught the morning light like a promise made visible. Inside, the air smelled of lilies and coffee, a mixture of life and memory. Volunteers moved between tables, arranging flowers, signing forms, hanging photographs of survivors on the pale walls. Each face in those pictures carried a story, and every story began where silence had once lived. Olivia Hayes stood in the lobby near the front doors, watching as a small crowd gathered for the opening ceremony. She wore a light blue dress that matched the color of the building's sign, her hair pinned back simply, her posture steady but soft. A few people recognized her and nodded respectfully, some with tears in their eyes. She smiled gently, though it was a different kind of smile than the one she used to wear, no longer polite, no longer fragile, but the calm of someone who had made peace with her past. On her hip rested a small child, 1 year old, her daughter's tiny hands reaching for the silver balloons that floated above them. "You like those?" Olivia whispered, her voice warm. The baby cooed, fascinated by the shimmer of light, and Olivia pressed a kiss to her forehead. The ceremony began with quiet applause as Father Thomas Byrne took the podium. His voice carried through the hall with the ease of someone who had spent a lifetime speaking to broken souls. "What began in pain," he said, "has now become a place for renewal. The storms we endure are not meant to destroy us, but to teach us how deeply we are capable of surviving." His words echoed softly against the marble floor, settling into the silence that followed. Olivia listened, her hand gently stroking Hope's back, her eyes drifting toward the framed plaque near the entrance. Beneath the foundation's mission statement were the names of its founders: Olivia Hayes, Eric Cole, Dr. Mason Reed, and Laura Kim. For a moment, her throat tightened, not with sorrow, but with something like awe. After the ceremony, the crowd thinned, replaced by the hum of quiet conversations and the sound of chairs being moved. Eric approached her, his sleeves rolled up, his tie slightly loosened, carrying a folder of paperwork under his arm. "You did it," he said, smiling, though his voice carried that familiar mix of pride and fatigue. Olivia shook her head, adjusting the baby in her arms. "We did it," she replied. "You made people listen." He laughed softly. "You gave them something to listen to." For a while they stood there in silence, watching the volunteers distribute pamphlets and pour coffee for the guests. "You ever think you'd see this?" he asked. Olivia looked around the bright sunlit space, then back at him. "No," she said. "But I think I always hoped I would." Dr. Mason Reed arrived soon after, dressed not in scrubs this time, but in a dark suit that made him look almost unfamiliar. He smiled at the baby first, then at Olivia. "She's grown," he said, reaching out a hand that the little girl promptly grabbed. "And so have you." Olivia laughed softly. "That's what happens when you stop running." Mason nodded, his gaze moving toward the window where the city stretched beneath a thin veil of mist. "You know," he said, "there's something poetic about it. The same rain that once nearly took your life is the reason everything here grows." Olivia looked at him for a long moment, then followed his gaze outside. "Maybe that's how it works," she said quietly. "Maybe everything that hurts us teaches us how to bloom." In the corner of the lobby, Laura Kim was arranging a vase of white lilies on a table covered in candles. When Olivia approached, she looked up and smiled, her eyes glistening. "I still remember the first time I brought you flowers," she said softly. "You could barely lift your head from the pillow." Olivia touched her shoulder. "And now you're helping build something that lifts others." Laura shook her head gently. "No. You built it. We just followed the light you carried." They stood together in silence, the candles flickering between them, casting soft shadows on the wall. As the day went on, more visitors arrived, survivors, families, people who had lived in quiet fear and now stepped into the building with cautious hope. Olivia greeted each one, sometimes listening, sometimes just holding a hand, letting silence do the work that words couldn't. She didn't see herself as a hero. She was simply someone who had refused to disappear. And in that quiet act of refusal, she had found her strength. Later that evening, after the last guest had gone and the volunteers had begun to clean up, Olivia walked alone through the empty hall. The air had grown cooler, filled with the soft hum of the city outside. She stopped in front of the large photograph that hung near the staircase, a picture of the foundation's construction site months earlier, the sky heavy with rain, the ground still muddy and unfinished. In the corner of the photo, a single worker held an umbrella over a pile of blueprints. The image made her smile. It reminded her that even beginnings can happen under gray skies. She climbed the staircase slowly, the baby asleep on her shoulder, her steps echoing in the stillness. At the landing, she paused, looking out through the tall glass window that overlooked the city. Below, the streets glowed with soft light, their reflections shimmering in puddles from an earlier drizzle. She remembered standing under that same rain once, broken and alone, thinking the world had ended. Now, she stood above it, not as a survivor, not as a victim, but as something else entirely, whole. Eric's voice called from below, breaking the silence. "You coming?" She turned, smiling faintly. "In a minute." He nodded and disappeared down the hall. Olivia looked once more at the view before her. The reflection in the glass showed her face beside her daughter's, both calm, both alive. The faint hum of traffic below mixed with the steady rhythm of her child's breathing, and for a moment, everything felt perfectly in place. She whispered softly, not to anyone but the air itself. "We made it." The words hung there for a second, caught between the fading light and the glass, before dissolving into the quiet. Outside, the clouds parted just enough for a thin beam of sunlight to touch the silver letters of the Hope Foundation, making them glow against the evening sky. And in that quiet, suspended moment, Olivia Hayes closed her eyes, holding her daughter close, knowing that the storm had not just passed, it had transformed her. The rain that once chained her to despair had become the rhythm of her healing, and now, beneath that same endless sky, she finally felt free,